So welcome to today's EDGEy conversation, exploring the question of what is innovation? And so we have gathered here really pondering that question. What's EDGEy? Maybe that's too far. I think that we can't even ask that question. We're going to start really with what is innovation. But first, doing a quick round of what has brought you to this conversation today? So for me, innovation is, I think there's lots of tensions of, is that a scary word? Is that something that's actually open? Is it something that's helpful? And so I was really excited about digging into what that meant for me. I'm just going to go by what on my screen and starting with Susie.
Hi, I'm Susie Henderson. I'm the Equity and Innovation staff member in Shining Waters region. So I'm happy to be here and connect into your larger network. And innovation, I think it is an open, but still a little bit murky, maybe for me. So there's lots of room in there to see what we mean by it. But I'm also trying to dig a little deeper into the heart of what we mean by it when we say. So I feel open to it and also still a little bit uncertain.
Thanks for the question. I am drawn to the question of what is innovation, because our world is going through big changes. It needs various forms of intentionality.
I'm drawn to the question because I think it's always evolving what I think is innovative and what's innovation. So I'm always excited to hear other people's perspectives and to just broaden my horizons of what can be considered and should be considered innovative, and just to hear other people's perspectives.
Hi, I'm Alexandra, and I'm drawn to this question of what is innovation because I think most of us end up thinking of the future and of what's new and what's coming and what's next. And there's so much innovation that is in rethinking what exists and honoring the history and the knowledge that we have. So I really love the balance and the tensions that are in that. So.
Yeah, I think I'd echo some of what Alexandra's saying there. For me, innovation is taking something traditional and hopefully holding on to like the values or the gifts of that thing, and then really reconsidering it and reimagining what it might be in a new way, and an intentional way. I think is a piece of innovation for me, is trying to do something new for an intentional reason, to do it differently.
Great. So we've already started to dig into the tensions. That word came up quite a bit, and maybe the duality, and yet we're actually going to start to maybe try and tease through that. So what is this word innovation? How does it trigger you? How does it rub you? How does it maybe actually inspire you? So there's different reactions to this word, I think. And what we're already hearing is like, how does it still hold in the tension of tradition? So innovation by itself, like how does it make you feel? What does it actually spark for you? Does it need to be translated? Or is it good enough? I'm not quite sure how people are feeling about that. I know that Joshua, you were looking at a really interesting article about how Indigenous peoples are viewing social innovation specifically. And there was translation in that. Did you want to elaborate on kind of the message in there?
I don't want to elaborate or interpret, but I could offer like a synopsis of it. That English is a construct. We have to name things in order to understand them and grapple with them. Like in somatic therapies, being able to name anger or grief or sadness, you can't really be with those feelings and therefore move through them. So English is an ontology or a worldview that has been superimposed on all these linguistic traditions on Turtle Island. And this woman had been a guest speaker, the author of this article. for a course I taught on innovation, on social innovation, and it was an anti-master class because master class, for example, became very big because of online education during the pandemic. To be able to radically reclaim that each person has their own subjective experience of how they move in this world based on their identities and experiences, that informs how they produce and interact with social change and social change systems. So giving people the power and the tools to claim innovation as theirs and their own agency in systems that are constantly disempowering them from that. And you see that with venture capitalists who are mostly men and mostly fund men. 4% of venture capital goes to women, and that's largely because, for many, many reasons, but a big one systemically that I focus on is that people tend to invest in people that look like them and act like them and sound like them and remind themselves of their own younger selves, which is why it's so important and beautiful to see so much cross-cultural mentorship for people in non-dominant identities.
So good. So like everyone can be innovative in where they're at. And sometimes it's just being able to recognize that. I think what's really neat is that with Embracing the Spirit, we do see often innovation in places that you're not always expecting it. I was speaking to someone the other day where in Saskatchewan, they have just come up with new legislation for governance to help nonprofits and charities do social innovation better and easier. And it's quite interesting that in social finance side of things, it came from Saskatchewan. And so people, you know, there's all this extra baggage that you go, it can't come from Saskatchewan, but it does. And on Vancouver Island, there's so much social innovation happening. On in Newfoundland and Labrador, so much. And so just because we don't hear the stories doesn't mean it's not happening. And it's that beautiful thing of, I wonder if they even know how innovative they are once we actually hear these stories.
I think that like what you're mentioning has really reminded me of some of the way in which innovation happens, which I think is how we then define something as being innovative or not innovative. But so much of innovation feels like it is related to unexpected outcomes. So you can take, I guess the easiest example that comes to my mind is Viagra, but maybe that's not the right example. But you know, it was a heart medication, and then it had this other unexpected outcome, and it became an innovation in a different field. And so you have these different externalities, is what they're called in the systems thinking world, where you expect the behavior of whatever it is to happen in a particular way, and then when something unexpected happens, it offers that opportunity to notice, and then that opportunity for innovation to happen. And in that kind of case, you know, paying attention to the way that we connect to our faith, for example, a lot of that happens through noticing those externalities or those unexpected things or those other moments. So there's like a really, there's a strong tie, I believe, between the two there. I think one other kind of condition around innovation is when you're doing something together with more than one person in a group, then you automatically are bringing together multiple different perspectives and ways of viewing the world, or viewing how something could be used, or viewing the education around it, or what have you. And that gives that view into how something could be turned from something that doesn't really make a big difference into something that does.
I really liked the message from at the Hopeful Economic Unconference of Darnell. I just was looking up his last name, Fennell, I think, who talked about how innovation, he sort of defined it as adaptability, and said that, for example, immigrant communities have always innovated like that. And he defined it, I believe, as sort of about adapting to meet the needs of the margin, right? And said that some communities have been obliged to innovate, right? Because the mainstream doesn't meet their needs. And so the way of living has been adapting. And I thought that was an interesting kind of counterpoint to the idea that innovation is just like a new thing that we just invented, you know? So sort of resonating with that idea that there is all kinds of cultural wisdom from marginalized groups around how to adapt, that people who have been served by the mainstream don't necessarily, you don't have to do it because you kind of get back what you need. And so that sort of privilege and margin kind of lens on this, I think, is a really interesting way to dig deeper around what we mean by our intent, because I don't think new is just good enough, right? And so I found that, and he suggested that there was a lot more work on that, and which I thought is one of the avenues to explore, and even just a way to try and lift up the wisdom that's already there, right? As, with some intention in our sofa, you know, how have the churches who've kind of created themselves from the margins, you know, not with the resources of the mainstream, how have they done that? But I thought those would be some stories that we might intentionally collect as a way to surface some of those strategies really based on that.
Yeah, I think that is so helpful and such an interesting observation. Like for innovation for me too is something outside the current system. So outside the norm or what's working for like potentially the majority, but really where something isn't quite working well is the innovation piece, the invitation, that's right. The invitation to do something different because it's specifically because it's not working for those that are being impacted. And I guess the creativity or the intentionality comes back to it for me too. Like Susie, I think I heard you say, like, it's not just new. It's not, it doesn't have to be totally, you know, it's not shiny and new innovation for me. It's like an intentional new choice or new way of doing things because things aren't working for those involved.
Susie, I love what you shared, and I'm a very, very lay theologian, but if it weren't for dental care, I would go first 300 years of Christianity before it was co-opted by empire, right? And like self-care was Black Panther's term for long-term perseverance, and now it's bubble baths, right? Like everything gets co-opted. I think innovation is being co-opted by capitalism. The only way to make structural change is by doing it through the markets, and that's hugely problematic. And from the parents of immigrants who are now reckoning through conversation with me and family and with the genocidal history of this land, there is such a complex thing within me and my kin around how immigrants from the global South and diaspora really reproduce settler colonialism here on Turtle Island in ways that white folks don't, because they're willing to or are able to or have to kind of wrestle with white complicity in a different way. So I would love, and I came from a formerly colonized part of India, my family, Roman Catholic Goans, and Roman is the name of the empire that Jesus was trying to subvert or meant to. That's the co-optation that I'm talking about. And I would love to hear anything theologically from anyone around that or around innovation being co-opted.
It seems like innovation does, like, what is the theological underpinnings? And maybe the word, we have to throw the word out or maybe buff it or add mud to it. Either way, we add something. But from the discussion, I was hearing definitely from Alexandra and from all of you, like there are actually maybe some spiritual underpinnings of all of this work, like listening, right? And so this unexpected outcomes that Alexandra was talking about, well, you have to be watching for them to see it, right? And then like discerning, is that good? Do we need to keep pushing? because it's still not actually doing like outside of the existing, the system's still not working. So we have to keep pushing. How do we figure that out? And then just doing something, there feels like that's a leap of faith by itself, and how much courage it takes. And when Bronwyn, when you were speaking, I was just hearing like, no, it's a lot of work. Like, like doing innovation, like doing this work is like, it takes the perseverance. It's not just an idea, right? So that's like, it's continuing to be authentic throughout. So I don't know, what are some theological underpinnings of innovation, of creativity, of like, is it kingdom? Is it systems change? Like, is that what we're talking about here?
As you were talking, Carla, something that came to mind was really around the skill of discernment, which I think is something that is unique to faith traditions, in that you are sitting with a concept and an idea for a while, and you're asking God what the connection is. You know, like you're kind of asking what is your purpose in relation to whatever has been noticed, or some trend or something. One of the things around innovation is not only like the noticing of what's happening around you, but it's that discernment piece and like asking, am I the person that is, or like the group of people that is meant to follow that energy? Is that my work? Is that the work of somebody else? Is my role in this to like to bring that like kind of noticing to someone else who then has that has the background or the space to cultivate it. I think really, especially these days, in the way that we're starting to understand more how we can do more harm than good when we just kind of like roll forward into whatever we notice in the world without taking a moment to see what's already happening there and see what role we may be able to play with respect to others who may be impacted by whatever following that energy is. So yeah, I think that discernment is really a unique part of our faith that we can bring to this innovation space.
I was going to say something very similar as you were talking about discerning if we should be the ones doing that or passing it along or something, and how it relates so much to what Joshua was saying just a little bit before about the capitalistic side of innovation. And I mean, we've all heard companies and businesses that develop an innovation arm, and is it, just as you were asking, Alexandra, is that arm doing more good than harm, or are they actually innovating something that is for the betterment of not just the current systems? I mean, we have civilians going to space now, which maybe that's great for the final frontier or whatever you want to call it, but is that the innovation that we should be sitting with? And I think that is the discernment that we really all, whether or not you recognize it in your faith or not, we all have the ability to sit and discern. And we're lucky that as people that are working for a church or have been affiliated or learning to embrace their faith, we do practice that. So I think that we have a lucky bit of practice and background in that, but it's something that anybody can cultivate as well. And you certainly don't have to be from a specific faith to discern whether or not you should be participating in this type of innovation or naming certain things only as innovative because they're new and shiny, as Bronwyn was saying. That can't be the only term.
So good. It's just so hopeful, I think, to hear like the strengths that we have as communities of faith, as people of faith around innovation and doing it well with, you know, the listening and the discernment prior to acting. So just to just kind of wrap us up here on innovation with a question of like, where have you seen it? And or where do you hope to see it? Where are you yearning for innovation at this time?
think that because some of the theological questions, I think it's sort of the same as like the capitalist questions, right? Like they draw us into the big narratives. So I think that the resource and the wealth and the sort of meaning of the land is the place, right? The wealth right now of the churches is in the property that, you know, we own or have taken, right? So to me, the big narrative that we kind of are challenged to work out is, you know, kind of walk the right way with that resource now that we have, right? So I think that the kind of charitable space, like even in the best definitions of why we have those places that are sort of about the commons or the public good, right? That we use our sort of resources for good, which is sort of where I feel like is some of our biggest capacity at this moment to shift, to kind of put our intentions forward and actually work on. That's what we have to work with. It's not so much people, it's not so much moral authority anymore, right, as an institution, but that's one place in terms of land and land resources where I do feel like we have a lot of it. We're not using it to the greater good for the most part, but it feels like one place where we really have some potential to do something good.
One of the biblical stories that I seem to continue to go back to is actually the Transfiguration, which took me a while to actually like that story. But Jesus goes up to the mountaintop with his a couple of his disciples that are sort of the closest and the ones that get it, and they go up and he's transfigured, and they want that to be the moment so badly, right? Like they're gonna build a monument there and everybody's gonna come and this is gonna be like where people get it. And it's not. Like Jesus is like, nope, just joking. Like we go back down to the valley, and then you know, you have the garden and you have the Last Supper and you have the death and resurrection, and like there's this whole thing around, yeah, unexpected outcomes, like the relationships and the tensions and the complexity of it, that it's not on that mountaintop. It's not like we don't just build 3 monuments and claim that land. It's actually down in the valley with all of the mess and confusion of death and resurrection. And so I think for me, that's the one of the theological underpinnings of like how hard it can be, but also that's where the value is. Like that's where we get it right, maybe sometimes in the complexity. And so I think I'm hopeful that I've met a lot of people who are able to identify the values that really matter and think, readjust their resources and expectations, as difficult as that can be. And so I think I'm hopeful that I've seen that in the church and outside the church and in between the church and the world. And I'm just hopeful that continues and that we can sit in those difficult spaces.
Pick up on that, sitting in difficult spaces, but I like that framing. For me, it's like asking another question, needing to see hope or find it in new places and allow others to them. How do I radically divest from the power structures that allow me to live my high quality so others can simply live? I think a lot about foundations and philanthrocapitalism right now. That's really meant to, like, very few foundations. Catherine Donnelly, faith-based, one of the few that says you can decide your own outcomes, your own metrics, to do it in a decolonized way as much as possible. it's very complex, and money is power. Land is our Western way of seeing wealth. So yeah, there's a lot of wealth in this conversation.
I'd say that there's a lot of parallel, I guess, between the idea of innovation and paradigm shifts as well. So one of the key paradigm shifts that we keep seeing happen over and over and over again with our work with Embracing the Spirit grant recipients or anyone really that we're working with EDGEy, is this shift from church as being the building to church being the people. And that, to me, that idea of like having a paradigm shift from one to the other is an innovation that happens locally every single time, over and over and over again. And that innovation happens to different people at different times, but it's the same kind of, it's the same thing. And when it does happen, you know, that the outcomes or like the result of that ends up being, you know, church in community. Yeah, it is an epiphany. And it's people kind of moving out of the building or recognizing that like the coffee time is as much church as the worship is church, and all of these different things, and that it has a big change and a big impact. So even like innovations don't have to be tangible. They can be these things that are intangible, like a paradigm shift or a mindset shift as well.
Well, hopefully the people listening to this did not come for answers, because I think we just gave them more questions, which seems to be the name of the game. So what is innovation? I think we pulled up lots of different questions, different stories to be reflecting upon it. And if you thought that innovation was something shiny and new, it turns out that it's really just muddy and messy. Thanks, everyone.